This is the story of how we got from a divided Italy to a united one. This process, known as the Risorgiomento, is an interesting piece of history. It's a story of many things. It's a story of ideology, it's a story of revolution, it's a story of blood, it's a story of heroism, it's a story of failure. In fact, it's a story of repeated, often comical failure. More than anything, it's a very good story, and something that teaches us a lot about both how human nature and how politics and political change work. The story runs, roughly, from 1800 to 1880. These are rough dates, and as we will see, it's an odd and interesting quality of the Risorgimento that an event that should be so concrete does not have a fixed endpoint. So let's begin. 1815 saw the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had been at the centre of the political world of Italy since 1796. He had responsibility for destroying and remaking the map of Italy. The traditional, ancient map of Italy was a patchwork quilt of many small, medium and large statelets. Names of these statelets include Naples in the south of the peninsula, Tuscany in the centre of the peninsula, Venice in the northeast of the peninsula, and Piedmont in the northwest. Napoleon broke this and remade it in his image. He largely tried to make Italy both liberal and nationalist. These are odd bedfellows, but do not be deceived. The combination of these two ideologies would be one that is to stick. It's worth pausing here to explain why. This ideology, loosely the combination of liberalism and nationalism, sticks together well in the early 19th century. Both represented a reaction against traditional monarchies. The idea that the common people should have some sort of state which they control ran against the traditional ways of doing things, primarily the divine right of kings. Both liberalism and nationalism see some attempt to put legitimacy in the welfare of the people, rather than the monarch. All people, regardless of wealth, are part of a national community. Similarly, liberalism sees that all people have a right to be represented in parliaments and other representative institutions. This liberal nationalism would become an ideology of an increasing number of people belonging to a cultural elite at the top of society. More on this later. Anyway, back to Napoleon. He made an Italy that at the very least paid lip service to the dual concepts of liberalism and nationalism. By 1805, a kingdom of Italy controlled a significant portion of the northern part of the peninsula. The Kingdom of Italy's constitution replicated that of France, having semi-representative institutions. This Italy had legitimacy grounded in ideas of liberalism and nationalism. In 1815, this Italy was dismantled. Those at the Congress of Vienna, that redesigned Europe after Napoleon, returned Italy into a peninsula divided and ruled by monarchs. The most prominent Austrian at the Congress, the Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich, took a major role in carving up Italy. He decided that, essentially, it should loosely belong to Austria. Big surprise for an Austrian, I know. As a result, the peninsula was littered with monarchs who were either sympathetic or loyal to Austria. Let's have a closer look. Look at Tuscany. Here, a member of the Habsburg royal family, Ferdinand III von Habsburg, took the throne. This is not the only example. Venice and Lombardy in the north were directly controlled by Austria. The Papal States in the centre of Italy and the Kingdom of Naples in the south were both allied with Austria. The only really independent state was Piedmont, which acted as a buffer between Austria and France. In this way, Austria controlled Italy informally in 1815. Austria's control was backed by Austrian force, and if Austria was overwhelmed, it had strong allies, namely Russia. What's more, most people on the peninsula had loyalty to their local state. It is not the case that most people thought that monarchy was against their best interest, or that there was some vile oppressor that kept them down and made them work. No, instead, most people had sentimental attachment to their local monarchy or political community. It is worth stating here that some of these states had robust and long-standing identities. For example, those in Venice certainly felt more attachment to Venice than the idea of Italy, which was abstract in character. Venice had an over 1,000-year history filled with conquest, wealth and cultural preeminence. The strength of the Venetian identity is something that most nations today would be jealous of. It's easy to read history backwards and assume that Italians like to identify with Italy. But unfortunately for us, history is never easy. This was just not the case back then. This is not to say that there were not nationalists in Italy at this time. There were, but as we will see, there were few, and they occupied insignificant space in Italian politics for quite a long time. As mentioned earlier, there was a really restricted cultural elite who did believe in some relatively abstract nationalist ideology. Initially, this was very small, and due to the strength of the loose Austrian-led order on the peninsula, saw very little chance of success. This would not change for a long time, but in the period from 1815 to 1848, slowly things began to move. There are two broad categories of nationalists in the period. The first was the Democrats, the second was the moderates. Both movements look like failures to an outsider, but both did have some impact which furthered the cause of unification. Let's look at each in detail. First, let's look at the Democrats. This group of nationalists tended to be the most radical. Their tactics largely involved attempted revolutions, which usually failed really quite miserably. In the aftermath of 1815, the Democrats had very little coherence as a political force. Their aims were unclear, and there was very little coordination across Italy. They tended to belong to the Carbonari, a secret society that had a liberal nationalist agenda. This is not to be confused with the popular pasta dish carbonara, which is a bacon and cheese pasta. Sorry for that cheesy joke. This grouping did have some success in revolution, most notably in 1820. This revolution was typical of the small scale and divided nature of the nationalist movement at this time, and it was easily defeated by the Austrian forces despite its initial success. In 1831, things got better for the Democrats. Informal control of the radicals came into the hands of Giuseppe Mazzini, a radical Genoese nationalist. Mazzini gave coherence to the radical Democrat ideology and structure to the Democrat movement as a whole. This was a step in the right direction for the Democrats, who increased in strength as a result of Mazzini's efforts. Mazzini's brand of radical liberal nationalism was a relatively coherent, if slightly odd one. It revolved around the notion that God had created national units. Italy was God's chosen nation, because it was the one with Rome. It was the duty of the people of each national unit to unite in a revolutionary moment and create a society and state based off a commitment to both God and the nation. The important thing to emphasize here is that duty element. It is not enough to have a united Italy. Instead, it was the act of creation of Italy by the people of Italy in spontaneous revolution that mattered. Mazzini saw that once this was done, there would be something approximating utopia on the Italian peninsula. Mazzini's organisation, known as Young Italy, gained in support and numbers. Mazzini sparked several revolutions across the peninsula. All of them were failures. They would usually involve the sad story of 10 to 100 youth storming some local town or city. They would attempt to rouse support among the so-called people of Italy. Instead, the motley group would be arrested, put on trial, and killed, imprisoned if they were lucky. The Bandiera brothers is probably the most famous example of this. In this episode of Italian history, two brothers and about 20 other nationalists headed for southern Italy, hearing that the peasantry were yearning for revolution. In reality, the peasantry, as is so often the case, were relatively conservative, religious, and did not like change. So when the expedition landed and the Bandiera brothers encountered some peasants, it was not as the Bandiera brothers had expected. The peasants are later recorded as referring to the Bandiera brothers as foreigners. This was not the sort of welcome that the Bandiera brothers had been expecting. The brothers were eventually rounded up and executed. It is therefore undoubtable that this sort of revolution failed in its most obvious objectives. However, Mazzini's failed revolutions did raise the profile of nationalism as an issue. The trial of the Bandiera brothers was well publicised, just as an example. Increasingly, the framework of the debate shifted. Nationalism began to occupy conceptual space as its own ideology rather than just as something vague and desirable. It became a relevant and known quantity. This, and not the revolutions in themselves, is the main legacy of Mazzini and his brand of nationalism. The moderates were the other group of nationalists. The moderates on the Italian peninsula were a group of individuals who opted for more, you guessed it, moderate techniques. They preferred to write, develop ideas, and put pressure on existing governments. They tended to be more willing to compromise in their achievement of a liberal nationalist goal. This may seem odd, but understandable given where they were coming from. The moderates were heavily influenced by the emerging fad of progress. They tended to believe that progress was both unstoppable and desirable, and constituted a set of necessarily interlinked ideas, namely nationalism and liberalism. As a result, incremental advances to either were acceptable and often desirable as a means to avoid rapid and potentially dangerous change. To understand what this movement was and what it actually achieved, it is worth looking at some specific examples. The moderates had existed in embryonic form for a long time, but they became a significant force in the 1840s. Two key, much-cited moderates were Vincenzo Gioberti and Cesare Balbo. Gioberti wrote a book on the moral and civil primacy of the Italian that represented success for the moderates. It was extraordinarily successful, selling 80,000 copies in 5 years. The argument in the book is essentially a practical guide to establishing an Italian nation. It centres around the notion that there should be a federative Italian nation that would be acceptable to the existing rulers of the peninsula. The presidency would be given to the Pope. In a similar vein to this, Balbo, in his book On the Hopes of Italy, looked to offer Austria compensation for leaving Italy alone. Once again, there was a recognition that there needed to be a practical solution to achieving the goal of a united Italy. The success of these books had an impact. In essence, it was to shift the nature of the debate. By the late 1840s, it was conceivable to think in terms of nationalism. It's important to understand this shift and not overemphasize its importance. Before the 1840s, although there were nationalists who did come from the elite of society, they constituted a relatively insignificant proportion of this elite. The elite did not really think in terms of nationalism. By elite here, I mean those who were close to the political, cultural and economic centres of influence. By the 1840s, however, this changed. Due to the joint efforts of the moderates and the Democrats, nationalism increasingly occupied conceptual space and became a known quantity within this elite. This is not to say that most of the elite believed in nationalism, but does mean it became something to which the political world paid attention to. This is the legacy of the efforts of the nationalists from 1815 to 1848. It may seem a conservative one, and in reality it is. However, it's also a necessary one for Italian unification, and one that, as we will see, allowed the force of nationalism to play disproportionate influence. From the hopeless position of nationalists in 1815, where no one would even pay them attention, it's not bad. Next time we look at the 1848 revolutions, explaining why they are a turning point in the process of unification. Before I go, I want to acknowledge a debt of gratitude to a few historians. Their work has been essential to the writing of this series. Christopher Duggan, Lucy Riall, Linda Reeder and David Laven have all influenced my argument in various ways, and at times I will agree with some of them entirely. In each video I will list who I've been influenced by in the description. That's all from me today. Thank you for listening, goodbye, and I'll see you next time.